Hi, and welcome back to another one of our online lectures here in world history. Today we're going to continue our unit on the age of exploration by looking at something really awful, and that's the Atlantic slave trade. So one of those things, as a human being, we should all really feel sick. We should feel awful that something like this was ever allowed to even happen. And it's changed cultures, it's changed continents, and really is a strong example of really how not to treat people. So we're going to take a good look at the Atlantic slave trade today. We've got one constructive response question. The question is pretty straightforward. The question says, describe the Atlantic slave trade and its effects. So no doubt we're going to look at kind of what led to the slave trade, how it was handled, and ultimately the major effects or changes that occurred because of it. So we'll have plenty that we can use to answer this question by the time we're done. So what are we going to learn here today? We'll talk about causes of the slave trade, we'll look at the process of slavery, and then we will look at the effects or the consequences of the Atlantic slave trade. So let's set the stage. Really, to make sure we understand why any of this occurred, we have to make an economic connection. So sugar plantations and tobacco farms required a lot of labor to turn a profit. I mean, they're very labor-intensive crops. And so in order to make money off of them, you need a lot of people. Native Americans were used sort of in the beginning, but the problem was Native Americans were not immune to the diseases that the Europeans brought. So Native Americans were cheap, but millions died from disease, warfare, and brutal treatment of the Europeans. They were not a good alternative, and I feel even terrible saying that, even suggesting the idea that people could be used for forced labor, but putting ourselves in the minds of the Europeans, they didn't want to do the work and they wanted to make as much money as possible. So you subjugate a group of people who you see as lower than yourself to do all the work for you. So they started with Native Americans, but they just were not really useful in terms of staying alive, sadly. So naturally, Africans are going to be the next choice. So the causes of African slavery. Well, slavery had existed in Africa for centuries, but was relatively minor. In fact, Muslim traders had been dabbling in slavery for hundreds of years, but not in the same way that the Europeans would during the Atlantic slave trade. Even some African tribes used slaves from other tribes, sort of as indentured servants, working off debts, things like that. But not true slavery where you get captured, you get taken away from your land, and you work the rest of your life for no pay. That's not the kind of slavery that typically existed in those regions. So I already mentioned this. Muslim traders ushered in an increase of slavery in Africa in the 7th century. So certainly it started before the Europeans. Muslims transported about 17 million African slaves from 650 AD to 1600 AD. 17 million over the course of about 1,000 years. 17 million is still a very high number but when you break that down over that period of time, it's definitely going to seem minor compared to what the Europeans do in the 14, 15, 1600s. They're going to have much, much higher numbers. In African and Muslim slavery, slaves had some legal rights and some social mobility. So you weren't just property. You actually had the ability to move up and in some cases buy your way out of slavery. Again, one of the big causes of the African slave trade is the fact that the Africans were immune to the disease that killed many natives, and that's smallpox. So you've got a group of people that are very comfortable working the land, but all of a sudden, that they're definitely immune to the things that wiped out as many as 90% of the natives in the Americas. Certainly that's going to be an advantage. Many Africans had experience with farming, so it's not like you had to teach them a lot. They knew what they were doing with the land. And, you look at this as part of the causes, but it certainly makes sense to the Europeans. You didn't want to lose your property. So if you bring somebody to a land that they don't know, it's going to be very difficult for them to escape. So Africans weren't likely to escape due to their unfamiliarity with the new land. And of course, if they escaped, their skin color made it easier for them to be caught. You try to blend in with a crowd of white people, you're going to stand out. So naturally, that was a disadvantage for the Africans. By the end of the Atlantic slave trade, Europeans had transported 9.5 million Africans to the Americas. So it is a very, very high number. Maybe not as high as the Muslims, but it's in a much, much shorter period of time. You can see here's a picture of Africans being captured. They're chained to one another. They have wooden yokes on them. You can see gun here, but one of the big things that I noticed from this image, of course, is the man with the gun, who is clearly in charge here, is black. He's an African. One of the themes we'll look at here, and we'll even see in the film Amistad, is that Africans often captured other Africans. So slavery spreads throughout the Americas. Well, Spain and Portugal led the way with the transportation of slaves. And a big part of this is, as we're going to find out, yes, we here in the United States are not guilt-free in this. There's no doubt the American economy, the United States economy benefits from slavery, but more of the slaves are actually brought to Central America and Brazil in a far higher number than were brought here to the United States. So those territories, as we've seen with the Treaty of Tordesillas in Central and South America, were occupied by Spain and Portugal. So during the 17th century, more than 40% of all Africans brought to the Americas went to sugar plantations in Brazil. 40%, that's very, very high. No place in the Americas had a higher percentage than Brazil. So they definitely had far more slaves than even the United States. And I'll show you this on a map very quickly here. As England's presence in the Americas grew, it came to dominate the slave trade. And we've seen that, we've kind of mentioned that throughout this unit, that Britain is sort of slow to the age of exploration. Sort of towards the tail end of this, they're going to be the dominant exploration country in the world, but doesn't start out that way. So here again, we kind of see that theme sort of manifesting itself. African society was broken down into tribes. So many African rulers and merchants captured other Africans and traded with European traders for gold, guns, and other goods. This is worth mentioning because it's that tribe system that allows a lot of this to take place. You don't have centralized governments in Africa. So all the Europeans really have to do is show up, find some Africans, whether they capture them themselves or not, in a lot of cases they did, or find some Africans that want new stuff. Guns were a huge thing that the Africans were interested in. You say to these Africans, go capture me 10 other Africans from the tribe down the road, and I'll give you a case full of guns. And naturally, that worked out quite well for both sides. It's terrible for the tribe that got captured, of course, but a lot of this was kind of manipulating the Africans to capture each other. So here's that map I was talking about. Black gold for sale. You know, talking about gold's always valuable, but this is obviously in human terms, black people from Africa. So here's where a lot of the Africans, I would say most of the Africans, came from, traveling here across the Atlantic Ocean. You can see Brazil almost 40% there. In British North America, only 4% of the slaves captured and brought over made it to what would become the United States. So that number is very, very low compared to the West Indies and Brazil. Sugar plantations in these regions are where you needed the most labor. In the United States, you had tobacco, you had cotton, but those were not nearly as big of cash crops as sugarcane was. All right, we're going to end there. So that's the end of part one. When we come back, we'll actually talk about the voyage itself, the horrible, horrible voyage called the Middle Passage from Africa over to the Americas, and then we will end with looking at the consequences of the slave trade. So go ahead and hit stop and cue up part two.